the title of this presentation, this big ambitious title, I'm going to unravel as we get through the many slides I have for you here. And it'll take about an hour for me to get through all this stuff. This title, World's Biggest Environmental Solution, is a title that the students at ACC chose when I spoke there last month, based on marketing language I'd sent them. They knew they wanted to do a presentation about biointegrity. And I knew I wanted to give them a bigger idea than I had been presenting. And so it was an opportunity for me to step this up a little bit more. There's more to say about this, but we're going to sort of focus on Roman numeral number 1 of this big biointegrity idea. If we have a chance in Q&A, I'll explain more about the bigger picture. But there's plenty here for everyone. So World's Biggest Environmental Solution, there's 2 reasons for that title. The first reason is that we're talking about a global solution. So in other words, a solution for the entire planet. Not a local solution, not a regional solution, but something that by supporting this solution impacts every living thing on the planet in a positive way. And the other reason is because we're talking about the most multifaceted environmental solution that I'm aware of. Now the climate solution, this is one of the themes. I'm going to go through a few themes, and these themes will be woven in and out of the presentation you're about to see. So the climate solution, I have a paper that's called the Systemic Climate Solution. You'll see that in just a second. The idea here is that what I've sort of stumbled upon is a way to address climate change that's not just about reducing emissions at massive scale, rapidly, for a very small amount of money, but also about protecting the functionality of our temperate climate system and restoring those functions. This idea of the forgotten memory is that these people have been living for tens of thousands of years. So the oldest human remains in Papua New Guinea, south of Indonesia and China, east of Australia, go back 40 to 60,000 years. This is one of the oldest indications of the first settlements outside of Africa. And these people have never forgotten. These are the sustainable peoples. They've never forgotten that they rely essentially 100% on other living things. And that's a value that we need to add back into our lives. And this is the theme that when I started giving presentations a couple of years ago, I began with. So this biointegrity solution is about protecting more biodiversity than humanity has ever endeavored to protect before. And then ideally moving that forward into restoring more biodiversity, creating more life than we destroy. We're in the opposite position right now. We're destroying things super rapidly. And protecting and restoring life is a more impactful climate solution than what we've been doing with our technology. This theme I really love. So you can see at the bottom of these steps, these are sort of steps I identify as major moments in human history. We first appeared on Earth around 200,000 years ago, is the current consensus. When we appeared, there was an ice age. That ice age thawed out roughly 10,000 years ago. When that happened, then it was possible for the first farming to begin. After the first farming, about 1,000 years after that, the first ranching, the first livestock harvesting, and so forth. Within a few thousand years of that, we had alphabet-oriented languages. And then, jump forward to the era of industrialization, which is really the era that we identify with. And of course, now we're in this period of incredible growth and rapid technology acceleration. And what we need to do is, in 2017, this needs to be the year that collectively we start to understand our biosphere and how it relates to us and we relate to it. And this is the question that really kicked this whole project off. And I'll tell you that story in a moment. But I wanted to know, what's the most impactful thing an individual, a company, a government, et cetera, could do about climate change and the extinction crisis? So the result of that question is this project called Biointegrity. Biointegrity began with the idea that I wanted to find global solutions to these problems. And I realized just by doing apples to apples comparisons between conservation and technology and so on and so forth, I realized that protecting and restoring life protecting and restoring the integrity of our biosphere is a far more beneficial, far more efficient, far more systemically restorative solution to our current environmental crises at global scale. So I told the kids last month at ACC that a better title for this presentation is A Lot of New Ideas. And obviously that wouldn't have been a very attractive marketing title, so we didn't go with that. But the idea is that you're going to see quite a few new sort of paradigms. They're new to me, and I think they're probably new to you. The presentation is organized into 3 chapters. So you can see here that the first chapter will be about life support services. Then we'll talk about the status of our climate and how biodiversity and climate are interrelated. And then we'll talk about action. Okay, so my story here is that I'd never really cared much about biodiversity. I was not a conservationist in any way, shape, or form. It's actually not a word I like, conservation, when you're talking about the environment. I prefer protection. And I had just asked this question primarily because I wanted to know what's the biggest solution. What's the thing, again, that someone can do that has global positive impact? I'd spent about 10 years by 2014 working on environmental issues 365 days a year with some of the people in this room. And at the end of those 10 years, I thought, what is the #1 solution here? This climate change problem is just raging out of control. What's the most impactful thing that a person or a company, whether you have $1 or $1 billion, you can do for the entire planet, particularly on the 2 most pressing issues, climate change and the extinction crisis? Now, in a minute, I'll break that down a little bit more. There's more to that story in terms of these pressing issues. But again, in looking at just apples to apples data set comparisons, I was blown away. And I'm going to show you what some of those results are. And then here's the paper. So I don't put citations into the slides because it makes them less pretty. But if you want to go find all the citations, there's reams and reams of research I've done. A lot of it is synthesized into this paper, The Systemic Climate Solution, which is on Google Docs. And let's just jump in here to the first chapter. So the forgotten memory again. The indigenous people on our planet, of course, are completely reliant on their relationships with nature. It's fair to call them the sustainable peoples. And so these people are in Papua New Guinea. This woman is in Indonesia. There are human remains in Indonesia that go back 40,000 years. This is in the Congo. And this is in the Amazon. And the majority of indigenous people on our planet are in tropical forests. And the most concentrated threatened indigenous communities are in tropical forests. But these people know that we need other living things to survive. At the moment, we have this sort of focus on technology, which is, has plenty of benefits, plenty of good rationale. This is obviously an awesome place. And this slideshow wouldn't exist, et cetera, et cetera. But we're moving away from this fundamental aspect of how the planet works and also the most fundamental solution to our biggest problems. In a modern sense, biodiversity equals life support in really tangible ways. So 100% of our oxygen comes from plankton and forests and vegetation. Obviously, all of our food comes from other living things. Most of our fresh water is filtered through living systems, forests in particular. And then these big functions that vegetation provides, absorbing solar heat, circulating moisture around the planet, those 2 functions have everything to do with the rate of global warming. And then regulating temperature of the planet as well. We also have the benefits of storing greenhouse gases, which I got to speak last night for part of Climate Justice Week. And the theme last night was putting carbon back where it belongs. So I just focused on carbon sequestration, carbon storage, and I'll explain those things in a moment. And those guys, I was really nervous, more nervous than I am right now. Those guys were just enthralled. And I was afraid that it wouldn't go so well because they're so focused on technology and governmental policy. But they had never seen some of the things that you'll see here. And we ended up talking for an hour and a half after the presentation. Here's one thing that most people don't know. More than half of our drinking water here in the US moves through a forest before it ever gets to your faucet. And we have all these, sort of public conversations about whether or not we can afford to reduce emissions, whether or not it's a good idea, so on and so forth. But what we should really be talking about, what we should really be living in acknowledgement of and organizing our society around is this idea that we have to have these things. We have to maintain our pre-profit economy, that very top little piece up there isn't possible without these other layers of biodiversity and ecosystemic functionality. So there is no human economy without a giant living system. We're the beneficiaries of millions and millions of years of speciation and development. We'll talk about that in one moment. In this moment, actually. So the history of life on our planet. The current consensus is that life began in water 4 to 4.2 billion years ago. The way this slide works, it's like the rings of a tree. So this is the oldest part of the slide, the center, and it fans out. It took about 1 billion years for the first single-celled organisms in water to become more complicated. So our planet, as current consensus, is 8 or 9 billion years old. There wasn't life on our planet for the first 4 billion years or so, and then it finally began. It was really simple for about 1 billion years. Then there was an extinction event, and speciation began to take place. Organisms got more complicated, and these dotted lines you see on the mass extinction events on the right-hand side, you see how the speciation is more grand each time. But life didn't crawl up on land until about 600 million years ago. So it took roughly 3.5 billion years for life to ever make it to land. Before that time, the lands of Earth were either rock or ice, and then there was the oceans. So everything you see when you go outside tonight is here because of other living things. The entire system. And the entire system has arisen in roughly the last 600 million years. It began with small microbial organisms. It began with slimes that crawled up out of the water and slowly began to speciate into more complicated organisms. And you can see there we are at the very end, taking a selfie. So this top ring, the most colorful ring of all, is our era. And that era is in a lot of trouble right now. This slide emphasizes that most of the life on Earth is microbial, and most of the life that's here now is because of microbial life. So first life here, all this other stuff before we get over to animals and plants is pretty much microbial organisms. On the phylogenetic tree, or the tree of life, we're just a little fringe hair on the very outcropping of it. Most people right now, of course, think that humanity is at the center of things and we can sort of do as we wish. But you can see we're just a really recent addition to the system. I'll go through that one more time. The core of life on our planet is far away from where we are right now. The dinosaurs went extinct about 65 million years ago, the last major extinction event. And so everything we have today essentially arose in the last 65 million years. And there's this great metaphor, although it's not exactly correct, this metaphor that we're sawing off the limb of the tree that we're sitting on. A better metaphor is that we're destroying the tree and thinking the limb will sustain us. So one of the big biointegrity propositions for the world is that we need to engage in global biospheric restoration, and that biodiversity loss should be our #1 concern today, partly because it's further down the line of urgency than climate change, but also for these two reasons, that biodiversity, as we talked about, creates our life support services. Without it, there's no way forward. And then that restoring biodiversity has this incredible systemic impact at massive scale relative to the solutions we're talking about right now. So here's some bad news. I was interested in the extinction crisis, but before you get to the extinction crisis, you should know about the loss crisis, biodiversity loss. So I was born in '71, I'm 45. There's a study that World Wildlife Fund does every 2 years. They've been measuring about 6,000 wildlife populations as indicators of the changes in biodiversity on our planet. In the 40 years between 1970 and 2010, their study that every 2 years showed that we had destroyed 52% of all wildlife on Earth. Now they do that study every 2 years, so when they came back and looked at the period, the 42-year period, it jumped from 52 to 58%. You can pretty much assume that we're well over 60% biodiversity loss now by 2016. 2017, sorry, I don't know why I said that. this is one example of biodiversity. It's a big concept, but we're talking about every living thing, from, again, the most micro living things to the most macro living things, all the way up to redwoods and blue whales and complicated human beings, down to single-celled organisms. But this is a mountain gorilla, and my mother, who's here, the first time I showed her this slide, she was really confused because she thought this animal had no face. It's the back of a mountain gorilla. But I love this image because it's so familiar. The shoulders and the hips and the thighs and so on and so forth. And often we don't think of other living things ever, maybe our plants and our pets, but there's this vast, rich world that we rely on. All the great apes on Earth now are critically endangered. That's happened in the last few years. These species predate us by millions of years, and these are our ancestors. Critically endangered means that at least 75% of their population has just been eliminated in their last 3 generations, and that their chances of survival are slim if we don't take action. And these creatures are just so familiar. I love this picture of them, these gorillas playing bicycle, something that we think of as our game. And this little guy getting the cold stethoscope, we've all had that experience. This is, the nurturing qualities of other creatures, and you see that all across the board, in plant life, in insect life, and animal life. And then this last image is really meaningful to me because you can see the intelligence there. And the more you sort of open yourself up to engaging with the intelligence of other life forms on our planet, the more amazed you'll be, and actually probably the happier you'll be. But this is particularly meaningful because it looks like the renditions of Lucy, the first hominids that began to populate the planet about 3 million years ago. And again, we showed up 200,000 years ago. So here's an important concept. What we're trying to prevent, really, by stopping climate change is the loss of biodiversity and the superheating of our planet. Because of these functions that biodiversity provide, the conversation around climate change is this ambiguous big idea that it's just bad and it needs to be stopped. But what we're talking about is a shutdown in the systemic functionality of our life support system because of the superheating and a couple of other ideas, which I want to break this apart real quick. So global warming is a term that is sort of ambiguously connected to climate change. These are 2 different ideas. Global warming, of course, means we're heating the planet up through the greenhouse effect, and that raises the baseline temperature of the oceans and of the surface, of the atmosphere. That results in spiky weather. Probably everybody was here in January, so you may remember January 30th, it was 18 degrees. 3 days later, it was 87 degrees. 4 days after that, it rained 9 inches. That's spiky weather. Those of us that have been around for decades, we remember when there wasn't spiky weather. And a lot of us are talking about it now. It's this, this incredible thing. And today it was 90, right? And on Earth Day it was 60, and that's 5 days ago. We're seeing spiky weather all the time. Now the result of these two changes, this warmer temperature triggering spiky weather, is what we call climate change, essentially. It makes for no seasonal stability. It means that the winter is interrupted by hot days, like in January, and that makes it really hard for other living things to survive. It's a terrible thing to consider, but it's worth having in your heart all the time, is that when we have these spiky days, any young creature, any old creature that's outdoors, whether it's a baby bird, a plant, that's an enormous amount of stress for that organism, and it can take that organism out quickly, and there are other aspects we won't go into. But those are the primary ideas about what global warming and climate change are, resulting in the rapid reduction in biodiversity on our planet. So it's sort of a double whammy. When we lose biodiversity, what we lose is this idea of the ability of ecosystems to create new life. And ecosystems is also an interesting word. It's one that's not really carefully articulated. But ecosystems are dependent entirely on biodiversity to become ecosystems. They're living systems. Without biodiversity, they don't continuously create new life. They don't continuously create life support services, such as food, such as water filtration. This is the most important slide in the whole presentation. So we're already way over the red line. We've reduced, as you saw, so much biodiversity on our planet in the last 50 years that now nearly 3/4 of humanity lives in places where biodiversity loss has been so substantial that those communities could lose life support services today of various types. And you'll see some examples of that in a moment. Okay, most people want to know what's causing it. Well, guess what? We've had a phenomenal expansion. But imagine if any other creature had doubled 2 or 3 times, like cockroaches, for instance, in the last 215 years. It would totally change the game. And so it took us about 200,000 years to reach the first billion human beings on Earth in 1804 when Thomas Jefferson was being reelected. And then, as you can see, just 123 years to double that. Less than 50 years to get to 4 billion. If you go back 50 years from today, 1967, there were roughly 3.5 billion people on Earth. We just crossed 7.5 billion people a couple of days ago. And so we're moving a lot faster in population growth than the UN predicted. As recently as 2012, they were saying we'd have, by 2050, we'd have 9 or 10 billion people. That's still kind of a popular idea, but we're adding over 100 million more people to the planet every year. So we should hit 9 billion easily by 2030. And all this expansion, of course, just means that we're literally taking up more lands, more oceans. We're just spreading out. There's more people, there's more structures, there's more roads, and we're consuming more resources. We're taking the resources of other creatures. So this is a couple of quick showings of this idea, this main idea. This is a better version of it from the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. It's showing that the main driver of the species loss today is our destruction of other creatures' habitats and our degradation of their lives, their degradation of their habitats, their resource bases, and so on and so forth. So it's analogous to someone knocking out your house and taking away your grocery store and just sending you out into the world to try to figure out what to do. And in some cases, of course, it's just we're paving over paradise, putting up a parking lot and destroying everything that was there. So the number one cause of this radical reduction in species is habitat loss. The extinction crisis is moving faster than when the dinosaurs went extinct, probably by at least 2 orders of magnitude. It took, currently it's believed it took a few thousand years for the dinosaurs to go extinct. But at the rate we're going right now, it'll take less than 300 years from today for us to lose 75% of all species on Earth. And this number is actually really a softball. The scientific community is, of course, like the academic community and the political community, trying not to sound alarmist. We're in an alarmist moment. So I'll show you deforestation rates in a moment, but I'll just tell you what that is. We lose an acre a second of tropical forests, for instance. Now, there's studies that show that on a single tree in a tropical forest, there can be 40 different species of insect that live only on that tree. There can be 40 different species of microbial fungi. There can be 40 different species of plant life. There's lots of endemic life, the life that lives only in that one little tiny ecosystem, that microsystem. And in our soils, there are millions and millions of species over a relative area. So one study shows that in a single acre of healthy soil, there will be as many as 100,000 different species of microbial life. And we're losing an acre a second just in the tropics. So this study is admittedly a conservative idea that I just mentioned, that at the rate we're going, not including global warming, that we'll lose 75% of all living things in terms of the diversity by the time we get to about 2250. So that looks about like this. And the interesting thing and the big idea, one of the first big ideas here, is that we need wilderness. It's a value that we don't have. Technology is going to help us with so many wonderful things, but it doesn't protect other living things. It doesn't create a systemic life for other things. One reduction of this whole presentation is just to say we need to put wilderness back as fast as we can, particularly in strategic areas. We can talk about that more in Q&A, but the big proposition in this presentation is that we should protect, restore, and reconnect biodiversity and biodiverse ecosystems as fast as possible. And I'm going to show you Earth's most biodiverse ecosystems in a moment. This one solution is incredible in the positivity of it. We'll jump ahead to the next chapter here. So biodiversity and climate. We were warned in 2007, if we didn't start reducing global emissions by 2012, that we would not be able to stop climate change. Now the good news, relatively speaking, is that we have flatlined emissions in 2014, 2015, and 2016. We've also increased global GDP. So clean tech is absolutely proven. It's way, it's on the downside of the whole sort of experiment. Can we have an economy that runs on clean tech? It's universally understood that this stuff works. It's a better product. It's inexpensive. It's a great investment. The conversation used to be, should you do it? Should you do it? 7 years ago, I was at City Hall advocating constantly for Austin Energy to become a greener utility. Now, by 2015, it was get in as fast as you can. These are some of the best investments in the world. But the planet is scale jumping in heat right now. So this is the worst part of last year. And the presentation I saw last night said that March of this year is about as hot as March of last year. Some of the worst effects of the warming, well, I would say the worst effects of the warming are on our coral reefs. These systems were really healthy for most of the history of civilization. And in the last 20 years or so, we've had a bleach event every 2 years somewhere on Earth, and we've had a global bleaching event about every 5 or 6 years. But this bleaching event that began 4 years ago is the most extreme, and it's also the longest lasting. If you read around about this, there's studies from very non-alarmist conservative scientists saying, they cried in their diving masks for an hour while they were looking at the Great Barrier Reef. That we've reduced these systems so rapidly. And the main reasons for that are the warming of the oceans and the acidification that's taken place from the ocean sequestration of greenhouse gases. That's a really hard problem to solve. What I'm going to show you is perhaps the fastest way to reduce pressure on the oceans. We've also got this issue going on. Now, this is a really scary one. Maybe we can talk about that in Q&A too, but this, as you can see, this is a scientist that spent his whole career looking at the history of our ice caps, and that all of a sudden things are moving so fast, things are melting so fast, it's just unprecedented. We've never seen anything like it. There's no question we're in an absolute crisis today in terms of climate change, in addition to the biodiversity problem. And that's why I was asking these questions. What's the number one thing I can do? As to climate change here in the United States, there's plenty of experiences that we've all had. I've got really close friends here from Wimberley, Mark and Heather. They were there when the floods hit in 2015. We lost people, we lost every cypress tree from a tidal wave of water, about a 40-foot tall wall of water. That had to do with an unexpected accident in the way that the system had been designed for drainage and this incredible amount of rain that came through. At Christmas 2015, there were these unbelievable storms that the weekend after Christmas, killed about 30 or 40 Americans in tornadoes, and then blizzards the same weekend that took out over 30,000 head of cattle, dairy cattle in Texas and New Mexico, and that's representative of a much larger biodiversity loss. Those are just the ones we're counting because they have economic value. It shut down the top 5 dairies in Texas. And on and on and on. There, we can look at flooding that we've all probably experienced. My friend Julie here has nearly been swept away a couple times in Buda in the last year. So I think we're probably all familiar with the fact that we're seeing extreme weather already. And in places where they don't have the infrastructure that we have, in particular in Africa, there's already incredible loss of life and a lot of people who are on the edge. But again, the warming is not the only thing that causes the climate to change. So if you look at this picture, now imagine that place, instead of being dry and devoid of life, being green, robust, being able to take on moisture, being able to maintain its microclimate, being able to feed all those cattle through an extreme weather cycle. And that can be achieved pretty easily with biodiversity restoration through ecological intensification. John Dromgoole is over here in the back corner, which I should really point out mainly because he's one of my heroes. I won't talk about John too much, but John knows an awful lot about soil life and about stimulating super biodiverse soil. That's the first key. Soil and soakage are the 2 keys to rapid restoration, and that rapid restoration can create sort of an insulated ecosystem that can, the more biodiverse, the more robust a system is. And this is a really easy thing to achieve. We can use the compost here from tonight. We can use the gray water here from tonight to make this whole place much greener, and it can be done anywhere in the world, just through terracing and making our soils more biodiverse. So in the academic and scientific world, when we go in and change things, pave over paradise, that's called land use change. When we left that last ice age around 10,000 years ago, 30% of global lands were covered by glaciers that are no longer covered by glaciers. But in the last 150 years or so, primarily since World War II or even in the last 50 years, we've changed 43% of global lands. This is called a state shift. So again, we've exceeded the scale of the previous transition, global transition. We can put a lot of that stuff back, not in decades, in years, just by getting smart about how our biodiversity works, our biosphere. Meanwhile, we're doing okay in some things. So clean tech has been this enormously wonderful success story so far. It needs to accelerate. I'm going to show you some comparisons in a minute for reference sake, not in any way to suggest that we slow down. We need to accelerate our adoption of clean technologies, but it's going pretty good. When I was at City Hall day after day in 2009, 10, and 11 doing various types of advocacy, we were pushing for getting out of coal and investing more robustly in solar and wind. At that time, the conversation was whether or not that was a feasible thing to do economically. And we were pointing out at the cost line trends, that it was clear that Austin Energy needed to pivot so that it could take advantage of these investments as soon as they came online. And one great thing about Austin is it has established this idea that it wants to be a climate leader. Well, it turns out the global clean energy movement has been enormously successful. It's grown by 10x in wind and solar in about 10 years. As I mentioned, the emissions on our planet have flatlined, and even 2013 to 2014 wasn't an extreme increase in global emissions. And meanwhile, the global economy is growing. The Paris Climate Accord back in 2015, the end of 2015, is a really, really positive step forward, and it establishes several big ideas, but the ones that I think are the most important are the ideas that we need to protect poor people, and that it's our responsibility to look after those that are the most affected by our emissions. That 200 nations came together essentially to say we do have the power to destroy ourselves. We need to stop that. We need to reverse course on that. That we should improve every 5 years. They should increase the standard of clean energy adoption at international scale through global cooperation, and that we should rely on forests for a lot of that sequestration, a lot of that emissions reduction. It's a really positive thing. And then lastly, we could talk about electric cars, but it's a short presentation. So this guy's clearly a genius and doing great things. The battery technology that Tesla released about a year and a half ago, I believe, is only maybe 2 years ago at the most. Does anybody know? About 2 years. So this incredible breakthrough in terms of the price, and just at the beginning of March or April, there's actually a professor at UT who's a battery scientist, and he's now again raised the bar, or lowered the bar, you could say, on costs and implementation scale for this type of battery storage. So the thing about sun and wind, as most people know, is that there's no sun at night, so how do you keep hospitals open? How do you keep food cold? So on and so forth. And wind is intermittent as well. We need battery storage that's extremely effective, extremely reliable over long periods of time, and affordable. And this is that first breakthrough product, the Tesla battery. They did one thing that I think is extremely commendable. They put their intellectual property for this battery innovation into public domain. And within a few months, we had Panasonic and I believe Samsung and several other major multinational corporations investing billions of dollars. So they created a market for themselves. And now we have an international movement to adopt these battery systems that thus empower the ability of us to use solar and wind and other renewable technologies that are intermittent in their generation of electricity all over the world. And this is a small model of the utility scale product. They've got a home product and a utility scale product. So Austin Energy, for instance, can use these batteries. So we need more of this stuff, as I mentioned. But we can actually get emissions reductions, global warming emissions reductions faster by working with biodiversity. And I'm going to break these things down a little bit. The other two big principles of heat absorption and water vapor circulation have the potential to slow the rate of global warming, which, as you saw, is scale jumping at the moment. We're getting closer and closer to this 1.5 degrees Celsius warming faster than any of the science really predicted. If that continues, if we hit 1.5 Celsius, based on the global average between about 1880 and 1910, if that continues, the 1.5 degrees Celsius is called genocidal warming. So if you think back of that slide a moment ago of the devastation in Africa, that's what that's a reference to, that the undeveloped economies in the world, particularly in Africa and then also the oceanic nations that will experience rapid sea level rise, will lose hundreds of millions of people starting around the time we hit 1.5 degrees Celsius. That was one of the big motivators for the Paris Climate Accord that moved that into a more proactive stance and less of a sort of, banal governmental idea. It's a much more active thing than we had ever seen in climate policy. But we've got to move fast today. So biodiversity can really, really reduce emissions and store emissions safely. This is primarily because trees and soil and plankton, but we're focused on lands here tonight, suck in greenhouse gas emissions. Carbon dioxide is about 75% of the global warming total. So this cute little picture here of this tree vacuuming up CO2 is representative of what we call photosynthesis. Every tree on Earth essentially is half carbon. And as trees grow, they just increase their carbon intake. Carbon is that element of carbon dioxide. CO2, one molecule of carbon, two molecules of oxygen. When CO2 passes through the atmosphere and comes in contact with the tissues of a tree, that tree will absorb 100% of the carbon into its tissue. It locks it in, and it holds it as long as that tree is alive, and for many years after it dies, presumably depending on how rapidly it biodegrades. And then it releases about 2/3 of the oxygen. So we talk about trees making oxygen. What's really happening, again, is trees are just eating and growing. It's just a natural process. Continued. But trees are these unbelievably benevolent beings. And they're like us. They just want to continue. They just want to have good lives. A really important other idea is that on land on Earth, 80% of all the biodiversity is in forests. This is for the same reason we're indoors right now, and that most of the people I know go from their indoors to a car, back to indoors, to their car, back to indoors. It's climate controlled, there's shelter, there's consistent access to resources like food and water. It's a comfortable place to be, and so you can do more, less stress. When we lose forests, we lose biodiversity the fastest, and we lose systemic functionality the fastest. When we protect and restore forests, we get it back. So let's talk about action and forests. So again, I had been working for about 10 years in a variety of ways. I was at a green retail store that was focused entirely on energy efficiency, resource efficiency, non-toxic living. The goal with that store was to empower sustainable consumerism. I thought that's the way to fix things. If we could make a green Walmart that makes it easy for every American to eliminate their environmental footprint with the way we like to live, that'd be awesome. We could reduce these problems super rapidly. And then the other theme here is this idea of protecting biodiversity as fast as possible. And it resulted in this mission I mentioned earlier, how to empower the most global environmental solutions. And I sort of stumbled onto this. This approach to protecting biodiversity has the very tangible potential of turning the ship on climate change and species loss in years, not decades. And here is why. So the first bit of good news that was really something that I didn't know, and I think all environmentalists should know. I said last night, and I like to say that the strategic conservation is the new environmentalism. So half of all biodiverse species on our planet, including global oceans, lives in tropical forests. The subtropical forests over there in India and China. But the red means the most density of diversity. and you can sort of see down from there, it's a yellow to green. And the tropical forest system ranges from Central America and India and China, across the Amazon and across Africa and across island nations in Southeast Asia. Those places have way more biodiversity than coral reefs. Most of us think of coral reefs as this most biodiverse place on Earth. They have about 6% of global biodiversity. The entire oceans, which cover nearly 3/4 of our planet, have roughly 25% of biodiversity. This system, which currently covers less than 5% of our planet, has 50% of biodiversity, and the rest of lands have 25%. This little bitty system. It's the oldest living system on Earth. And after the dinosaurs went extinct, life respeciated through the tropical forest. They've actually made it through the last major hot age and the last major ice age. They're the most resilient systems on our planet. And you can see across the board here, I'm going to get another drink of water, but let you look at this for a second. Fungi are essentially microbial organisms. Ants are sort of a proxy for insect life, plant life. The freshwater fish piece is really fascinating. So I think it's maybe a bit of an exaggeration, but there's a common meme in conservation that in a single pool of the Amazon, there can be more biodiversity in fish life than in the entire Atlantic Ocean. And then you can see as well the other things in that collective slide on the bottom right. All of that biodiversity, all those relationships, all those different types of species working together combine to create our most concentrated life support systems on the planet. 20 to 30%, so roughly 25% of all oxygen comes from the same system where all this biodiversity is. 20 to 30% of all fresh water is filtered through that same system. About 2,000 foods, maybe 3,000 foods grow there, but the global food system that we have today, the industrial food system, is anchored in tropical forests. Then because of the climate system functions as well, so there's the greenhouse gas reduction, we're going to talk about in a second, the carbon sinks, the heat sinks, the moisture circulation, all those facets, all those functions have everything to do with the weather that we have here and around the planet. To give you a sense of how powerful old growth tropical forests are, so a rooftop solar system in its 25-year lifetime reduces 25 to 50 tons of greenhouse gas emissions by generating clean electricity. But a tropical forest, a single acre of tropical forest, will reduce 1 to 4 tons as a fair conservative average. So it's 1 to 4 times as powerful as a solar system. And it's a net positive system for hundreds of years. This little place. We'll go through real quick. These are various mappings of what's called stored carbon. So a carbon sink is not the idea of a sink in a bathroom. It's the idea of something that goes into a place and stays there for a long time. So the carbon goes into the forest's tree biomass, like we talked about, and also the soils, and stays there. And when you look at, these are comparative mappings of soil and tree biomass carbon storage. When you look at the entire planet, tropical forests are just far and away the most carbon-dense land-based ecosystems. There's one more study. Comparatively speaking, the three major forests, the three forest systems we have, the boreal forests are the northern forests of Canada and Russia, temperate forests are where we are, and tropical forests around the equator have about 55% of global carbon, so it's more than twice as much as the boreal forests. And of course, they sequester carbon faster. They suck it in, like we were talking about with that vacuum and that little cute cartoon. So if we stop the incineration of tropical forests, which is one of the main ways that we're losing them right now, I mentioned that rapid rate of deforestation. We reduce global greenhouse gas emissions by 24 to 30%. So for purposes of simplicity, I just say 25%. But 24 to 30% within a year to a few years, just by stopping the destruction of our most biodiverse ecosystems, also our most concentrated life support systems. And then this is showing some of what deforestation looks like. In my lifetime, essentially, we've lost half of this system in its total size. I think a fair analogy in terms of all the different things that tropical forests do and that living systems do is to compare it to the vital organs of the body. So imagine your vital organs being half the size they are. The reason it says at least 50% is because we've also degraded, degraded and fragmented with roads and so forth these systems. So not only are they smaller, but they're not as connected as they were. We can get a lot of that back, again, really quickly, in years, 3 years in some cases. And this unfathomably fast rate of deforestation, an acre a second of loss, and there are studies that show an additional acre a second of degradation has been going on for at least 30 years, probably 50. There's no data that goes back that far. These are just showing different types of radical tropical deforestation, from agricultural development to timber to mining and so forth. When you look at the entire planet, the scale of loss is just kind of unbelievable. These are forests that are at least 10,000 years old, but they're connected to a lineage of millions of years, 65 to 100 million years. That's an area twice the size of Texas. And you can see it took about 20 years to go from being 85% forested or so to beard stubble. And that's happened all over the planet. So the Congo, right in the center up top, if you look down, is now about 50% the size it was. Madagascar, we've lost about 90 or 95% of those forests. Southeast Asia, India, and China, that loss has been over more like 150 years, but that's completely stubbled by now. Indonesia, the Southeast Asian islands, is rapidly disappearing. Central America is fragmented and stubbled. Here by Rio and Sao Paulo, we've lost about 93% of the forests just in the last 50 years. And the Amazon's been reduced somewhere in the range of 20 to 25%. And one of the primary ways that forests are cleared is just through fire. It's fast, it's inexpensive. Clearing these forests that way doesn't just destroy other life forms super fast and maim and so forth. But it's actually arguably our biggest emission problem. But if you discount the sequestration that these forests provide, because they offset their own emissions, most years it's a bigger emissions problem than global transportation emissions. So we can all relate to the idea and the guilt of driving a gasoline car and flying and so on and so forth. But when you look at the UN reports, the last 2 UN reports, tropical rainforest incineration, tropical forest incineration is about the 3rd biggest emitter of greenhouse gases. And that number moves around depending on the year. But in 2012, the entire EU created about 10% of global greenhouse gases. Burning up our most biodiverse ecosystems created more like 12%. So all of the tailpipes, all the smokestacks, all the landfills, all the manufacturing emissions, all of that stuff in that entire 50-member nation organization was less of an emissions problem, just in the one column of emissions, than burning up these places that have everything to do with our climate system. And if we stop this problem, again, of burning up the forests, we get this incredible reduction in greenhouse gases. One of the presentations I saw last night was the most damning thing I've ever seen in my life about how far behind we are on emissions reduction. Arguably the only way we can get there at the speed we need to in terms of global emissions reduction is by protecting these places. And that's why I'm speaking. When I started out, I was just talking about tropical forests. I have a bigger message now, but tonight we're focused just on this most impactful solution. If we restore the tropical forest system, essentially double it in size, which would require quite a bit of innovative city planning and recorridorization and all kinds of community-based activities and some time, it would reduce global emissions by 50%, roughly. And that emissions reduction would continue for decades as the forests regrew. So real quick, a couple of the systemic functions that come from tropical forests. So everybody knows that the equator is the hottest part of the planet. The sun hits here all day long, every day. There's really not a big seasonal shift. And when you look at heat, the way heat is reflected on our planet and heat is absorbed on our planet, the only thing that's really capable of absorbing massive amounts of heat at this point are the tropical forests. This is one of the ways we can slow global warming, is by protecting and restoring these systems. There is really no other solution. The idea of reducing greenhouse gas emissions to slow global warming is not necessarily accurate. You know, we're talking about essentially quitting smoking to cure a systemic problem, to cure cancer. We need to restore the vitality of the planet. We need to restore the circulatory system of the planet so that it can absorb more heat, so that it can slow down this rate. And this is the other big piece here. This alone should get us $100 billion for these forests. This is what I call the tropical moisture conveyor belt. So this is just a year in the life of water vapor on Earth. You can see it's totally concentrated around the equator. Tropical forests and tropical oceans, 365 days a year as the planet rotates, the sun heats the oceans and the forests, and that water vapor just moves from east to west. It's the only system for water vapor circulation that interacts with both hemispheres. And as we've reduced the system in size and in functionality, we've reduced that function, causing greater storms, causing greater droughts, dislocating seasonal cycles, and so on and so forth. I believe it's intimately tied to the extreme weather systems that we have, the long-term weather problems we're having, such as the drought here in Austin that probably lasted 2011 to 2015, something like that. I'm in California now. The drought just broke, but that drought, according to some people, was 7 years long. The way water vapor moves on our planet is it bounces between the ice caps and this moisture conveyor belt system. And so everything that happens in between is global weather. The theme last night for that presentation, for that week of climate advocacy is Climate Justice Week. So another huge aspect of tropical forests is that all of the world's uncontacted tribes live there. There's over 100 uncontacted communities. These would be Stone Age communities. As I mentioned earlier, the greatest concentration of threatened indigenous communities. These are vastly beautiful, individualistic communities that some have been around, as you saw at the beginning, 40 to 60,000 years. And the reason these forests are so effective is because they're so, I don't know if anybody here is on my email list, but I put out this email today that said so tall, so old, so layered, or something like that, which I was hoping people would think I was talking about myself. But anyway, this system it's the most layered above ground system we have. And that emergent layer idea of 125 feet. So the Statue of Liberty from base to top of torch is 150 feet. These are extremely tall. And you can see how massive these trees get. Some of them live for well more than 1,000 years. When you look at tree height just comparatively of the other forest systems, it's clear which system is the most mature. And then this idea of this incredible, vast, closed canopy. The Amazon was roughly the size of the continental United States just 50 years ago. And in terms of restoration, because of this moisture cycle system that is consistent and because of the consistency of weather, we can restore tropical forests in 3 to 5 years in some cases. We can get back to closed canopy. It won't be 125 feet tall. It might be 15 feet tall. But the system will grow back and start to provide real functionality and really nurture and sustain and regrow biodiversity as well. Biointegrity is a one-man team in terms of the employee department. There are several very important supporters here. But since it's me that does most of the work, we're focused on the first of these 3 values. Where's the biggest bang for the buck? It's in protecting the old growth systems in the tropical forests. I call this globally strategic conservation. We're looking at the place that has the most impact, most positive impact on the entire planet. It's the fastest way to reduce the most emissions, save the most biodiversity, and do the most for our entire climate system. And again, we're talking about a small area of the planet that we need to deal with. But it's also the least expensive and the most affordable way. Half of the people in here at least have made a donation to biointegrity already, so you're familiar with some of this stuff. But here's one example. In 2015, the World Bank spent $2.3 billion, or invested $2.3 billion in clean tech projects to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions by about 2 billion tons over 25 years. They could have, though, each one of those dollar signs is $12 million. They could have, though, just protected $12 million worth of our most biodiverse ecosystems, which would have had this enormous systemic benefit and social benefits as well. A side note, most of the work that the World Bank does is not really about the people or the place. It's more so about the developers. And so there's a lot to be said about community-based conservation. And biointegrity has now helped, through matching donations and strategic conservation, help protect over 81,000 acres of old-growth forests. But this slide from last month, we had protected a little over 75,000. The amount of carbon that we're reducing on an annual basis by protecting over 75,000 acres of forests is equivalent to over $1 billion worth of rooftop solar, more than all the solar that's in Austin, all by protecting the most valuable ecosystems on our planet. If you have a chance, go to biointegrity.net to get a little more of a feel. And our annual report shows a number of metrics that we're impacting by protecting these ecosystems. We've been able to work to support projects around the world. We haven't even raised $100,000 yet getting all this done. And it protected an area now about 2.5 times the size of San Francisco, over 15,000 species we've helped to protect. The amount of stored carbon in these forests is equivalent to 1 coal plant's emissions for more than 7 years, generating oxygen now for more than 600,000 people, filtering more than 1 billion gallons of fresh water, helping approximately 150 indigenous communities maintain their land rights and develop in a more sustainable way, and then literally saving species from extinction, which is kind of where I started on this thing. Again, endemic species are the ones that live in a single place, and these are just identified species, so they're proxies for a lot more biodiversity. But an endemic species is like a local yokel, like I used to be in South Austin. If you lose that place, you lose that being, as well as the critically endangered species, the endangered and the vulnerable. And this is all through community-based work. That's really the most impactful work, the work that empowers the cultures of these places to continue on their own terms and works with nonprofit organizations that, like a church, they have an altruistic mission. Their value is to protect this place in perpetuity. That's the value set that we need. What we need now is to develop an economy of environmental stewardship at global scale. And that's where I hope we're going to go over the next 1.5 years or so with biointegrity. And this total impact of protecting these forests has offset San Francisco's carbon footprint now for well more than 4 years. And their 2010 carbon footprint was actually bigger than their 2015. One last piece here about action. So we've been promoting this month a project that I honestly believe is the most impactful project on the planet right now. It's in the Amazon. It's called Idaho, and it's the expansion of an already successful, already established community-based conservation project in the Amazon in Peru. And it's incredibly easy to help. Since biointegrity is not yet a nonprofit, we don't really take money. You can send money to biointegrity, and that'd be great, but we send it to other organizations that are doing the most impactful work, which I can explain. So, the smallest mocha at Starbucks is about $4. This place adjoins what many people believe to be the most biodiverse region of the entire planet, a place called the Yasuni Wilderness. There's a matching donation on this project. So for 56 cents with the matching donation value, you can help protect global life support services, help protect thousands of species. There are about 1,000 indigenous people that live on this place, but this project the expansion is massive. It's a 1.3 million acre expansion of an established park, and it's a corridor project between the Yasuni Wilderness, that's believed to be the most biodiverse wilderness in the world, perhaps. It adjoins that place and connects to 3 other indigenously controlled lands for a total of 7.8 million acres of protected lands. It's a breakthrough project for the Amazon and for protection of systemic functionality, biodiversity, indigenous cultures. The people that live here are believed to be perhaps the oldest cultures in the Amazon. You also get the massive greenhouse gas reduction benefits and storage protection benefits, and then the systemic climate stuff. We only talked about 2. When you compare something as simple as a $25 donation to this nonprofit project, which is tax deductible, energy efficiency, light bulbs, and so forth, or a carbon offset, a certified carbon offset, or big tech, or protecting Idaho Pie, this is how it nets out. So that $25 for light bulbs and such will reduce about 0.2 of a ton of carbon over its lifetime, 9 years or so. The certified carbon offset, nearly 0.5 ton. So far, you can't get very far on big tech with $25. But you protect over 11,000 tons of stored carbon in the Amazon for $25 right now because of that matching donation. And the species benefit, the indigenous people, and the systemic benefit of the whole system. Again, this is arguably the most the best deal in the world if you want to do something impactful on the environment this year. And with the matching donation, $25 protects 44.05 acres. And your donation would actually go to Rainforest Trust. They are now the most reputable conservation group in the United States, and certainly the most reputable tropical forest conservation group. They just got a 100 on their Charity Navigator assessment. They typically score in the 97 to 98, but this year they got a 100. So they're graded on most of the nonprofits in America are assessed by this group, Charity Navigator, and they assess them on transparency and financial management. Rainforest Trust is so good at what they do that 100% of your donation goes to the project. They cover the transaction fees, they cover their staff fees, they cover my fees. Also that your donation, 100% of it goes. It's literally separate fundraising that they do, and that's why they got this high score. Only 9 nonprofits in the entire country got the 100 this year, out of thousands. And you can access that link most easily and learn more about that project, see some photos of the species and the people and so forth, just by going to biointegrity/donate. So this is pretty much the presentation, you guys. Big ideas here, that a small amount of money, or a large amount of money if you're so inclined, can really, really impact the entire planet by protecting tropical forests. And this is a friend of mine who's a school teacher. She marched last week with a biointegrity t-shirt. She donates quarterly to biointegrity, or to biointegrity recommended projects. This is a friend of mine who's a grandmother. She donates $10 and $20 whenever she feels like it. Now for about 2 years, she's had an enormous positive impact. She supported Tonight also. This is Austin's leading climate advocate. He's a millionaire, and he's done a lot to support this project. He's put in thousands of the projects that we recommend. And these are more friends of mine. You know, my friend James with the cutest little girl in the world, my friend Brandy with her husband Scott, her cute kids. Brandy's over here. Rock stars, more grandmothers, college professors, single moms. Anybody can help. Literally 56 cents is more impactful in emissions reduction than a $15,000 solar system, plus all these other benefits. So those are the big ideas. Please support these projects, and it's just as easy as going to the website. So let's do some Q&A. Thank you very much. And thanks for letting me take my time. It's a rare opportunity.